Hi everyone! We recorded this week's ep at an extra special preview of The Substance we held with Movie at home in Manchester 2 weeks ago. It's a real gory body horror hagsploitation in a gaudy pink bow, so be warned to look up trigger warnings before you go into it. Thank you Ione for being my co-host, Olivia for production, and the Movie team for partnering with us on this one. The Substance is out in cinemas now, so please watch it before listening if you don't want any spoilers.
Hello everyone, I'm Ione.
And I'm Gina.
The founding editor-in-chief of Polyester.
And I'm Gina, the senior editor of Polyester.
Thank you all so much for joining us and sticking around after the film. Yeah, mine's a bit blown.
Yeah, so I saw this film like 2 months ago, and immediately after leaving the screening, I rang Ione. I was going, ah! And then I only seen it for the first time tonight. So we've got a very fresh perspective from Ione, so I'm really excited to pick her brain, because not even in that 50-minute interval I got a chance to properly.
What were your initial thoughts upon second viewing?
On second viewing, I think it was more gory than I remembered, which is crazy, because I was like, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. It also gave me lots of more thoughts on depictions of female bodies, I think. Like the way that not just the like grotesqueness of it, but the amped up visuals of like the sexy bits, like when Sue's doing her show, like I kind of like hadn't brushed over it, but I think when you first watch something and then you like think about it, like you hone in on those like really gross bits and like the really extreme bits, but when I was watching it, like the contrast of those really like glossy bits really stood out to me.
Yeah, I think that definitely, I mean, the first thing I noticed was that Margaret, how do you say her last name?
Margaret Qualley?
Qualley?
We're terrible at last names.
Has fake tits in it, which I thought was interesting, that like even the vision of beauty was still like artificial in some way. Well, she's completely artificial, but as in like they didn't try and, I feel like they played into her naturalness in some ways, like very like doe-eyed and like big teeth and like gorgeous and youthful, but then her actual body was like very, very unrealistic in a way and did like evoke plastic surgery, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. There's like a plasticity to the whole film, and I think like it's one of those things, isn't it? Like you always hear like your gran say when you're growing up, and she's like, not even she looks like that, and you're like, yeah, gran. But Margaret Qualley doesn't look like that, and she's like the vision of perfection in this film.
I was saying in the interval, I wonder if they asked Andie MacDowell to do it.
Oh, that would have been good, wouldn't it? I thought the casting for this is so like on the nose, like not just Margaret Qualley being like the daughter of an actress and being a young actress in Hollywood, but Demi Moore, like the last big thing that I remembered her from before this was her having like loads of headlines for looking botched at a runway like about 5 years ago.
It was way less than that, which I think was interesting because realistically she was probably already signed on to this project and already had read the script and already had filmed it. I think it was last year at Fashion Week where she was getting all that shit because she walked in a Fendi show and everyone said that she looked botched, that she'd had a bad facelift.
I love a face job.
And she denied it, which I also thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that she has or hasn't, but in the research in her interview mag that she's just done the cover of, in her interview there, she said when she went for the role and she auditioned, I'd love to know who else auditioned, but anyway.
Andie MacDowell, I'm telling you now.
But you know, like Toni Collette was almost in Chicago.
Yeah.
Like, I just love thinking about... Anyway, regardless, sorry, I'm going off topic. In the interview mag, she's like, oh, the reason I got the part partially was because I gave the director, Coralie Farage, I worked really hard on the pronunciation. I gave the director a copy of my autobiography, and in it she spoke multiple times about like never feeling in touch with her body, and like all the times she's done like naked scenes, like when she was younger she didn't feel sexy or empowered because of them. She did them because she knew it would like move her career on if she did this, etc, etc. So she was like, I never felt in control or beautiful in my body, like even when I was like seen as the height of that.
Well, I actually think that the quote says something a tiny bit different, which I thought was interesting. It was basically saying that every time she did something like that, like the famous naked Vanity Fair pregnancy cover, something that pushed her outside of like what she felt comfortable in for her body, it was her way of trying to get over it and try to get over these insecurities and try to be comfortable with herself, which is kind of, I feel like a thread that is basically the film. That is basically the film, like trying to like purge yourself of ugly thoughts by doing something that makes you feel scared or uncomfortable. Like this is like the darkest, most visceral version of that. Like What are those like? I feel like there's so many memes where it's like destroy your old self.
Oh, I know, but it's like the through side of the film is you are one, like you are all the past selves you've ever been and all the people you're going to be. So like when she's like, I don't want to be her, she's just sitting rotting on the couch, like I'm just enjoying my life and I'm making the most of it, so it's not fair that, but that's how we all live. Like we all have those sparkling shiny Sue moments, and then we all have the depressing Elizabeth moments.
Well, I would say more than that. Like I would say it wasn't, I don't think it was meant to be like either of those situations are normal. I think we all do, like rot and stuff. But I think it was more, I think there's a reading in there somewhere about like hustle culture. I mean, it's a very like thin reading, but as in like you push yourself too hard to become the best version of yourself while like in private you are like a disgusting feral beast.
Yeah, it was making me laugh because I was like... It was making me laugh because I was like, wouldn't you just love to retire early at 50?
Oh, I know, yeah, my dream.
And
to
you
cook.
got your big fucking mansion, you got your French cookbook. Like, what more do you need? You've done it all.
I mean, I suppose part of that was, though, that, like, you'll never be satisfied if you're painting yourself in the image of men only. Like, the only people that she interacts with and talks to, I think, even in the whole film, is men. Like, it's a man on the phone, it's a man at the TV station, it's all the men executives, the cameramen are men. She doesn't interact with the other dancers or any of the other people on set, so she's literally, like, building this perfect version of herself in men's image, and she can never be satisfied with it because there's always more to want and always more to do, because under patriarchy we're never going to be satisfied because we're oppressed.
Yeah, it's insufferable, and I think it's interesting that the film also like reflects those images. Like I was watching Sue and I was like, you can just picture a boy like watching just this clip on YouTube and having his rocks off, can't it? Like it when you take these images out of context, but even like using them like in context, there's still this like promotion, like there's still the like Margaret Qualley showed to us being like the perfect vision of what men want. And then there's subconsciously there's a part of like, is that's reinforcing like those beauty ideals.
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting that like the time in which the film existed was quite like unmoored from any specific period of time, like any decade. It could have been anything from like the 60s to now. Obviously they had phones and key cards, but then they also used like home phones and all of this other stuff. And I feel like at first that annoyed me a bit. Like I kind of like it when films do that and like build their own world, but it felt like, oh well, why are the cars old? Because they look nice. Because older cars look nicer. Do you know what I mean?
I think the whole film was like a play of that, like the bit when she just like builds a room. Like there's such like a suspension of disbelief in it to tell the story, and I think obviously the film is 2.5 hours long, so like you do have to skip those bits where it explains stuff or explains the time setting you're in.
Like another reading of that could be that, you know, these beauty standards haven't changed. So Elizabeth went from being that beauty standard to aging out of it. But yeah, our beauty standards have remained exactly the same. We've just found different ways of packaging them and marketing them and accepting them.
Yeah, there's the bit where she's like on late night telly and she's like, Tyrannosaurus fit. She's like, it's so easy to shit on older women. And I think that's the ageism that's explored in this film is really interesting, especially like using hagsploitation to go into ageism is such like a fun way to go about it, especially when we've had maybe in the past like 2 years ago there's quite a lot of like hagsploitation films coming out. Hagsploitation is when films or TV show depict, or even books I guess, and when media depicts like older women as like the villain, and they're villainous and scary because they are old haggard women. And that's kind of like the crux of it. Like they've gone past their prime. They're having like then that's what turns them evil because they're not wanted or adored or gorgeous anymore. Which is like funny that this film kind of turns that on its head, but also leans into it as well.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a subversion of that in some ways, because you're meant to think the like young, gorgeous girl is the evil one.
Yeah.
It reminded me of the Suspiria remake, the Luca Guadagnino one, quite a lot. Yeah,
she was like the sister of the one at the end.
What? You can't just like very vaguely reference like Tilda Swinton.
Yeah, at the end of the film where it's like the mother of all the witches who's like got like the saggy tit and is ancient and haggy. She looked like her sister.
And Barbarian.
And Barbarian, yeah, like there's so much, it's like referencing all these different hags and then showing like an empathetic view of like how someone would come to that state of being.
I mean, I think it was also selfish in a way though, like, so in those other films, those people are like directly mothers, where it was like Elizabeth's being a mother was born purely out of like selfishness of wanting a better version of herself. And I think that was carried through when she couldn't give it up. Like when they were like, you could give it up now. And she wasn't like too far gone or anything. And she was like, no. And she just couldn't give it up because she wanted to be loved and she wanted to be adored. And I feel like there's a whole other like mummy issues layer to this film that could
100%.
easily be unpeeled.
Yeah, definitely. You could really look at it through the lens of like how parents treat their kids, especially like what's the TV show with the kids? The one where they
Every TV show that's ever existed.
the reality one where they're like they pageant kids. Toddlers and tiaras. Yeah.
What was your point?
Well,
You've really lost me.
The mothers in that treat their kids that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is kind of exploring that.
I mean, it's kind of like the exact same thing, right? Like once you're like quote unquote past it in the eyes of like Western beauty ideals, you just send out your daughter to do it for you. But then that backfires when you're jealous of her.
And it also backfires when your daughter's like, fuck off, mom.
I think Demi Moore did like an incredible job. I think she did an incredible job across the board. I mean, I think an actress of her caliber, even like being down to do all that body horror stuff is so refreshing and interesting. I think the film was definitely like better for it, like better for being so practically, like so heavy on practical effects, so visceral. Like I don't think, because I feel like at the beginning a bit as well when it was like the eggs close up and then the smile close up and then the prawn close up, it was a bit like, okay, we get it, like you're trying to be gross, and then it actually went there and was disgusting.
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of like how grotesque those things are when you look at them like in HD. So, and then like just amplifying that through actual body horror. There was an interesting article in our research from Dazed that was exploring body horror in the new age. There's been so many body horror films that have come out recently, and it was by Billy Walker for hyperallergic, and it's called Is Body Horror the New Intimacy? And I found it really interesting because it's talking about how we can't we're in like a post-irony state of like being, like we can't watch like a film that's earnestly about love, earnestly about connecting with one another, earnestly exploring mummy issues, earnestly exploring ageism. We have to explore it through this really like gross and disgusting amped up way.
I think I'd say I disagree with that. I mean, I think part of the reason that this film felt so like interesting and fresh is because it builds on like a foundation of so many like exploitation films, B-movie films, like John Waters films. Like, I feel like there's so much like camp in there and all of these things, and I feel like that's why it kind of works so well. Like I read in our research, it was like, oh, this is if like a Jane Fonda aerobics lesson was Picture of Dorian Gray, and that is literally just that, isn't it? Like these are stories that we've been telling forever and ever and ever. I feel like this one had a bit like, I feel like its like moral compass was a bit more skewed than in like Dorian Gray, where it's like a straight morality tale, you know, like it is bad to be vain. Like this was like, even though it hit you on the head, over the head, like more, I think its motivations were less clear in a way. Like the lines were blurred as to who was right and who was wrong, and what was disgusting and what wasn't.
Yeah, I think that's what I like about any film. That's what I like most in films like this, when they like blur who you're meant to be rooting for, or they make it so you're not really rooting for anyone except for like the hag at the end.
Who did you root for?
When she put the earrings in, I was like, good for her.
Do you feel like, I don't know, like I feel like when I was watching the final iteration of The Monster, I was like, oh, is this like weirdly ableist or not?
I think when she was speaking, it was a little bit, I was like, I don't know if we're allowed to do that. But then we've been doing that with like men in films for so long. And I think that's what I really liked about this film, is that it made body horror feminine. Like it did like a girly edge on it. Like I just watched Crimes of the Future by Cronenberg. And I hated it because I was like, it's grey and miserable. Like you're making surgery the new sex, but it's fucking just as like, why is it all monotone sand colours? Why is everyone talking like that? Like why, like when I think of viscerality and like horror and grossness, like I think of being a woman Like I think of being a gross girl, and it reminded me, you've got a chapter in your book, Poor Little Sick Girls, that goes into this.
Yeah, I do. But I can't remember properly what it says. But I think like the crux of it was that basically abjection is something that's very interesting, and I think this film is such a like one on like 100% it's a form of abjection, in which that like it basically means to, you know, like to cleanse something you have to go through the most disgusting form of it, the worst bit of it, make it as disgusting and horrible as possible to like emerge out the other side, which I mean is very obviously that film. But like for example, throwing up, you know, when you throw up and then you feel so much better afterwards, like that kind of vibe.
Yeah, like popping a spot.
Yeah, popping a spot, like all of these types of things. And the argument in my book was that basically that feminism needs to go through some form of abjection of its own, in which like, you know, we cast out the girl bosses and the pink and the like nice flowers and the infographics and the self-love t-shirts, and become like this very like disgusting, unappealing thing. In order, it kind of like wipes the slate clean, and then you've got a fresh start and you can really like build something from that. I mean, I think visually definitely like I would still stand by that, and I think that's also what makes horror films so refreshing, is because they historically have basically been used as tools of the patriarchy to like scare men into enforcing the patriarchy. So when Stephen King wrote Carrie, he said, oh, it was like a cautionary tale of what happens if women's liberation is successful. And you can see that in so many films, like the way that, you know, it's like a gorgeous, gorgeous woman that gets like tragically killed when she gets too much power. I mean, I think this was an interesting flip on that, in that it's like a woman gets more power, and self-destructs. Like it's not a man that, well, it is in a way. I don't know. It's very layered.
Yeah, and I think it's trying to do what you said that abjection achieves, specifically on beauty standards and like ageism and beauty.
In what way do you think?
By like making it as disgusting as possible. Like what are you willing to sacrifice to be beautiful?
I mean, I think there's a line in this film where it's like it becomes so absurd that it's not disgusting anymore, it goes to funny, and then it doesn't really crawl its way back to be disgusting again. I think that's when you get like a really visceral experience with this film though, like after she morphs for the third time, and like when all the blood is like splaying everywhere in the end scene. I mean, I think that's when you really start, like it's more of like a physical reaction than like an emotive one or anything like that. I can't remember what my point was.
I think it's one of those ones though, if you don't laugh you cry. Like I could laugh at that monster like getting dolled up, and like she deserves her time in the limelight, let her sing her song. But like you could also like watch this film, like I can imagine watching it on my own, like just crying for her and being like she tried to do what everyone wants her to do and ended up as this exploding on the pavement.
I can see the pearlification of her like coming down.
They hate to see a girl boss winning.
We're gonna have those like blue dresses and some like girls with earrings on their heads.
Oh, that'll be the ultimate Halloween costume on her.
Yeah.
If anyone can be arsed though, I'll be Margot. you crack on.
How are we doing time-wise?
I think we're ready for audience questions now.
Who has a question?
Hi, my name's Sandra.
Hi.
When did you realise that women's beauty standards were dangerous?
Oh, don't know, like day one.
Yeah, I think so. Dangerous. I mean, I think it takes a kind of like being able to have a bird's eye view on yourself and like the world. Like I think it's a lot of the time, and still in how we talk about beauty standards and the beauty industry and all of these things, it's like centered on like how it makes us feel, and not really like the actual damage it does in terms of the wielding of power and how it oppresses marginalized people, and how it's like actually really a tactic that is dangerous and keeps marginalized people marginalized. So I think that's like almost a long road to realize that in yourself, and I think especially externalizing it, not just being like, oh, this is a me problem, do you know what I mean? But I think most people get inklings early on. No?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those ones where the more you can dive into it, the more different like layers of it you like unpick. You're like, well, I hate beauty standards because they make me feel like shit. And then you're like, I hate beauty standards because all my friends feel like shit. And then you're like, I hate beauty standards because it means that fat people are oppressed and die young.
What was that Margaret Atwood quote that Eden always said?
Oh, I know, it's my book.
Is it?
Yeah. It's the one that's saying like, as a woman, you'll always have like a male voyeur inside of you.
Yeah, like inside you as a man watching a woman.
Yeah, exactly. And great.
So we have to kill those men.
We have to kill those men. And that's the
Moral of the story.
Or explode on the pavement.
Yeah. Has anyone else got a question?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
For me, the monster's capitalism. It feels like the misogyny and just oppression of capitalism is the message, isn't it? That's the monster, really. And it's not really a question; it's just a comment, really. I just feel that that's what the film's about.
I mean, all roads lead back to capitalism in the sense that like the women were products, right? Like the women were products for the men to like play around with, and I think even like Margaret was a product that Elizabeth literally made. Like literally, we didn't see any like transaction of money, but like we can assume it happened.
I know. I wonder how much it was.
Millions. But I also think it was interesting because it kind of like wove so many threads in how capitalism can be so pervasive in terms of like wellness and medicalization, like especially being set in LA and in America, like they pay for healthcare, which like thankfully touch wood we don't yet, and like the extent that people go to be considered well, and that is also so tied up in beauty standards in a way that is like damaging, because if you don't look well then you're not considered well or like worthy by society, and therefore you can pay to get out of that hole by like, you know, more and more extreme ways of doing that, as we're seeing. Like it's, you know, obviously this is like a science fiction spin on it, but it's not a million miles away from what we see people doing like every day with their money in order to stay young and stay well and stay healthy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the film really also takes down the way that Hollywood is built to be capitalism and like reinforce those beauty standards. Like he says multiple times, like the manager is like, for the stakeholders, we're doing this for the stakeholders. They don't want an old girl, they want a new girl. You're pretty, smile for the stakeholders. And then it shows the stakeholders as like all white men in black suits, because they're the ones who like benefit and make the money from us all feeling like shit. And even like the imagery of the film, like the Hollywood nature of it, the way it kept flashing to palm trees, and the way it kept showing that it starts with the star on the ground and that symbol, and then it ends with it. Like it really reinforces how Hollywood has played into those things.
I mean, I wrote down that it really reminded me of this artist called Signe Pierce. Do you remember her from like Instagram era?
Yeah, with the mask.
Yeah, and she was like 6 foot, like plus 6 foot, blonde, and she did this film called America. She's still alive. I don't know why I'm saying she did. Like she made this film called American Reflection, where it was like, I think there must have been a reference in there. So she was basically wearing like a mask that looked like a motorcycle helmet, but it was a mirror, and then like walked down Venice Beach and like saw how different people in the public reacted to her. And I feel like in a way this film is an extension of that work, because by watching a film in a very, very small way, we all like feed into like the Hollywood industrial complex. And I think very on in the film, I had this kind of thought like, oh, well, how much can the call come from inside the house? Do you know what I mean? Like how much can this really be critiquing when it also exists in that system? But I mean, at least making us question those things is like a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially by casting someone like Demi Moore and then also Margot Qualley, and also picking them as these people someone who used to be very beautiful, someone who is very beautiful in the now, and considering it that like contextually through actual Hollywood versus the like displayed Hollywood is interesting.
I agree. Do we have another question?
Yeah, like it was really interesting to hear what you said around like kind of like the next phase of feminism, of like actually like going to the ugly, you know. But I was wondering like about the limit of actually body horror when it actually like connects to marginalized bodies, because I feel like our ability to laugh or to like understand the theme of the movie through this body works a lot, because we're looking at skinny, white, beautiful women who are transforming into monsters. But if we put the context of actually marginalized bodies in it, and the reaction of the audience might have been different. So it's like a thought, but also a question around how can we go beyond what we've seen in body horror through that feminist lens, and if you have any example of movies that you feel like have shown more of that kind of marginalized perspective.
I mean, I think that's definitely true, and I think you're right. Like the film only works on so many levels because we are seeing like beautiful white women play out And still, I think there's like question marks on like how the disabled community will react to it, like all in all. And I think like it's a complicated answer. And I think the answer probably lies in that we can't rely on media and culture such as this to like give us the answers that we want. Like my answer would obviously biasly always be like that we have to make it for ourselves, because as much as we all feel the pressure by like beauty standards, so does this film and so does this thing that we've just watched. And like even if we were to make like a intersectional body horror, you can't control like the lens of the audience. So I think it's like very complicated and very interesting. And I can't think of, can you think of any examples?
Not a body horror, but I watched Pig, which is about this.
Yeah, I was gonna say Pig.
It's a Spanish film about a fat girl who gets like revenge on all the people in her town who were really like bullied her for being fat, and it's really, really good. And I think it plays really well with like the way that like flipping it on its head because someone like has a sexual attraction to her, and that's what empowers her to just go on like a murderous rampage. And I think you touch on this in your book as well, where like it gets to the point where as a marginalized person you have this rage within you that you need to express, and it feels almost monstrous. And I think that a film like this, I wouldn't say wouldn't work, but it would have to have like a completely different thread through it, because that rage that she feels against beauty standards is complicated because she's the one who's promoted them for so many years. She's like the epitome of it.
And then I think something else interesting about like horror and why marginalized people can connect to horror so much is because like, yeah, obviously like on some very like basic level we can identify with, you know, monsters or people that them as marginalized figures. And it's interesting because up until recently, that's been like a secret layer of it. Do you know what I mean? Like people haven't created films that are marketed for that. So now I think we have like the possibility of more interesting work because hopefully more people are allowed to make the work. I think like something like we've seen that coming through with stuff like I Saw the TV Glow, which isn't like a film I necessarily even really liked, but I think it's interesting that we can now see these like very richly textured films that are purposefully talking to lots of different audiences at the same time, and we're not just like, oh, I actually relate to that even though I should find it disgusting. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think there's also a bit of me in this film where I'm like, it's what she gets. She got to be gorgeous and now she gets to be horrible like me. Suck it.
Also, thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you everyone who's asked a question actually.
I just wondered your thoughts on it being kind of like an ugly sister, quite literally, to the Barbie movie. I feel like the way that the Barbie movie presented women is like intersectional and you can all be beautiful in different ways, versus this being like an abject rejection of beauty standards as a whole. I feel like I related to this as a presentation of sort of body image and the way that we're subject to it more so than the Barbie movie, because that felt like a very glossed over kind of like Hollywood sheen, and this was a takedown of that. And I just wondered if you drew any parallels yourselves with that, or to generally the kind of like Hollywood push to intersectionality that is not really intersectionality at all.
I think in the research, and we didn't get to touch on it in the podcast, there's an article called Her Body is a Problem by Lauren Elkin for Aeon Mag, and she's talking specifically about an artist, but I think it applies to this and to the Barbie movie, where it's talking about feminist image, and that there's no true feminist image anymore because you can't present the female body as neutral. Like it will always be viewed through a patriarchal gaze, like any kind of female body. And I thought that was really interesting, and I think it applies to Barbie and it applies to this film, because we can watch Barbie and say it's not a perfect feminist film, but there's something that I write about in my book where I'm talking about we need like entry levels, I feel, to feminism, to fat liberation, to all these different topics of conversation. And I think like you can watch Barbie and then watch this and be like, this film's so much better. It evolves those points so much more than Barbie did. But I think like watching Barbie when you were 9, you can watch this when you were 9. Do you know what I mean? So I think I would have tried. But the article says that it quotes this critic called Janet Wolf, and it says there's no correct feminist aesthetic, and it says there's no escaping the patriarchal meanings of the female body, there's no recovery of a neutral female body. And I think even that being applied to like Margot Robbie's body in the Barbie movie, people are like, she's born to be this role. Like imagine individualizing her and getting in her head about that.
But then I would say that it is interesting that they both obviously exist in like similar worlds. Like they both take the same color palette. They both like draw inspiration from the 80s. They both have like dance numbers. Like they both very much like pull from this same thing as like this aesthetic is bad, as in like the all-American 80s, like plastic fake, but just take very different approaches to it. And I think that's kind of like a narrow view of things, no? Like I feel like they do it to different ends, but you know, I think part of why we enjoyed that film so much is because it looked really good and it like made you laugh by being so in your face. And I don't think that's 100 worlds away from what Barbie was trying to do as well.
Well, it's like that thing of like having an ironic being like feminism pink. That's bad. Like that kind of lens can be applied to like is kind of the narrative of both these films. I don't think it's even a lens.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How would a way for both like narratives to coexist? Do you think it would be possible? For the stereotypical like pink pretty feminism, like do you feel there's space for both?
Yeah, 100%. Like I feel like a lot of what Polyester does is that, and I think what drew me to make a publication and make a zine was seeing so many artists on Tumblr using like stereotypically feminine aesthetics to subvert them and like find the power in them. And like it's not as simple as being like pink bad, like something out blue, I don't know, some other color good. Like I think that feminine aesthetics are obviously so maligned in our culture in so many different ways, which again is just like another tool of patriarchy, and yet constantly sold to us. So the only way through that is like reclamation and interrogating our enjoyment of such things and subverting them.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I raised the ranks to senior editor. Amelia?
I was just wondering your opinion on how patriarchy can make us literally hate each other as women, because I think one dialogue that is particularly repeated throughout is "you are one," which is that you are both the same person, and yet with that they could have maybe made it work. Like it was 7 days on, 7 days off. You know, they could have worked it out, but they literally tore each other apart in the like because of female hatred and how patriarchy can make us hate each other. Like even in terms of like older women maybe being jealous of younger women, but then I think there was levels of maybe the younger girl, I forgot her name already, Sue, how she was maybe jealous of her because of the career that she had, because she dragged her down on the talk show, but she'd had an amazing career and she couldn't even bring herself to say, actually, you know what, I was a fan. So I think that's how I perceived it. I just wondered if you had a question, you had any thoughts about the "you are one" statement.
Yeah, I think the patriarchy breeds competitiveness between marginalized people, specifically within those own groups, because it just benefits them that if we're all like arguing with each other and seeing each other as the like enemy, we don't look at the wider picture and who's breeding those like seeds of aggression between us.
But on that, I also think there was like a really conservative thread that ran through this film in which it was basically like everything in moderation, right? Like 1 week on, 1 week off, you all like stay in line, play your part, and we can all have a nice time about this. Like it rejected kind of like indulgence, like especially at the beginning with the man eating his like prawns. Like overindulgence was such a theme of this, and I think that was quite like a cynical thread that ran through it, if that makes sense, in terms of like I feel like it was kind of saying, you know, if she just did it right, then they would have both been fine. Like she wouldn't have aged to look like a hag, and the other girl like would have been able to live like forever or whatever. So I feel like in that sense, it wasn't an out and out takedown of these standards, and it kind of like made me think, oh, are they just saying that like you can get a bit of Botox, get a bit of filler, but like no facelifts?
I know. I think the point is that it'll never be enough. Like you'll always have that greed in you for what you think that you want, and the way that they frame that is making it competitive with one another.
I don't know, because I feel like we're also entering like an era of the world that is very devoid of pleasure. Like, for example, drugs like Ozempic are literally saying that they're removing like our pleasure hormone, so you never want to eat, and that it's also addicting. Like it's also curing like shopping addictions, gambling addictions, all of these things. And it's like, well, basically we're moving towards a society that really views overindulgence as like a very bad thing. And in that film, she overindulged too much in the good times and then became like the ugliest version of herself because of it. I feel like it's kind of like a weird conservative like line to draw. Do you know what I mean?
Definitely. I don't think marginalised people can overindulge.
Tell it.
Tell them. Is there any more questions?
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering how you feel about sort of the audience reaction at the end, like in the film, their audience, when she has completely transformed. I don't feel they treat her quite like how I'd expect people to treat a monster, because they say freak and they push her and they touch her. They don't like scream and run in horror, which is maybe what I was expecting from the audience. In my head, it was reminding me of Quasimodo from Hunchback of Notre Dame. And maybe, I don't know if maybe it was an attempt to touch on the ableism that is quite honestly a little bit transparent. She's become, you know, she has these facial differences, and that's sort of what is making people horrified, and sort of just what you think about at that moment.
I think it goes back as well to, like she's not going to be seen as a out and out threat because she's not doing anything scary, if that makes sense, like in that moment. But then also I think it kind of goes back to the fact that like she's on a stage and she's an entertainer, so they're being entertained, and it's just gone from one end of the spectrum to the other. Like they're entertained in loving her, they're entertained in hating her. And it was definitely interesting like to watch it with an audience and like see how like we react to that as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's such like a feeling of spectacle to her,
which I think was definitely purposeful.
100%. And our final question, I think there's one at the front here.
Hi.
Hi.
So something I noticed throughout the movie is that even when Sue was at the peak of perfection, her life didn't really seem so perfect. Like the guy that she got with absolutely was awful. A lot of the scenes with her, the palm trees didn't look as aesthetic as in other movies. And also, I don't know if I'm just being picky with this, but I think another thing they kind of focused on was that Sue's teeth weren't fake white, you know. They kind of honed in on the fact that they were a bit yellow when she was smiling all the time. And I just kind of want to get your opinion on that, if you think that was a detail.
She's literally like a workaholic with no mates. Do you know what I mean? The one time she goes out, she's wearing the worst outfit and brings a man back. I think like if you actually took her life out of context, like she's not really having like the best time apart from being beautiful, and it shows that like the amount of sacrifices you have to make, not just from like killing your mother, but from like the pleasure principle, like you were saying.
I mean, I think that was something I noticed throughout the film as well with both of them, like Elizabeth and Sue. You never really see anything of their personal lives. I mean, it probably just speaks to the fact that they don't have personal lives, like they have to commit themselves to it over and over again. Like, I kind of wish we got to see the date that Elizabeth didn't end up going on. Like, I loved the scene and like the fact that she couldn't because she wasn't happy with how she looks, but I would have loved to see her like, you know, on that date as well, just to get like a bit more of what these characters actually are and how they feel about things.
Yeah, and I think when that's the thing with society, like if that's the thing with society. Sorry, I've had a wine.
I'm like, what?
That's the thing with achieving beauty standards, if they are ever achievable, is that it takes so much time and effort. Like that is literally like, I remember in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, there's like a series where he gets absolutely ripped. And he did a Instagram post about it. And was like, yeah, this is totally achievable. If you get a network to pay for you to have like the same trainer as the Marvel men, and you work out 8 hours of the day, and you don't eat meat, you don't drink, you don't do drugs, like it's that thing, you have to give up pleasure to achieve beauty. And I don't think that should be the way that we see the world.
Agree. Last question.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I really enjoyed the film in terms of being an entertainer and being middle-aged now and being left aside for some things. I thought it would be interesting to see how, like, you know, like as younger women, do people like look at that and be like, oh yeah, that's the future for me, in terms of that's how society works. The minute I'm like over, I think it's the first film I've seen where someone like actually predicted my like current life. So I just wondered what everybody else felt about that, like as the younger people, like feeling like, oh my God, that's terrible, or that's not my reality. Like that would be my question to use and to a lot of the people in the cinema, because it was just the first time I'd seen a film that kind of was like, yeah, that's exactly what it's like trying to be a woman in the entertainment industry. So
yeah, I think in the interview I was talking about how I really want to show this film to my mum and be like, is this how you feel? But also,
Bloody hell.
but I also think like her answer would be, get fucked. Like, how dare you? I think it's such like an amped up, like, I don't really know anyone in the entertainment industry who's like a fucking legend, like Demi Moore. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think
Well,
it's one day.
someone that knows many. No, but I also think it's interesting as like people that aren't like conventionally beautiful and don't adhere to like westernized beauty standards, like how much whatever like you don't experience that anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like I know, like, you know, you read all the time, or like you hear someone say like, oh, you know, when you turn 50, turn 55, you become invisible. But I feel like as fat women, like to men at least, you can be that quite a lot anyway, or like a lot of the ways that you move through the world are different. And I'm sure that applies to like different, you know, types of marginalized people like across the world, like whether it's race, whether it's like disability, like gender, all of that stuff. Like I feel like the literal only way you can have that person's experience is by being someone as beautiful as Margaret Qualley, which is like just her probably, like in the whole world. But I think saying that, like obviously ageism like compounds onto marginalizations, like it doesn't replace one for the other, and like just gotta hope it's going to change and try and make it change.
No, I think one of the things that I thought the first time I watched this film was like, great, so it never stops. I just have to feel this way forever. But I guess that's a bit of a horrible take to take away from the film.
And with that, we are finished. Everyone go home.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
I wasn't actually being serious, but okay, we can wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for your very, very thoughtful questions.
Yes, thank you, Olivia, for sound teching.
Yeah, Siam and Charlotte and Mubi for having us. The film, we've all seen it now, but the film's out in the cinema on the 20th.
Thank you, Home, for hosting us.
Please tag us in any socials.
Thank you. Thank you, Ione.
Thank you, Gina.
Bye. Bye.